And I want to do two things in this session. The first part, I want to talk about what's happening in the world of education, and particularly highlight how we're moving towards having more formal and structured school partnerships. And I'll have a pause for questions or discussions and challenge. You can quite okay to disagree with me and say so. And in the second part, I want to then talk about, as it were, the hallmarks of effective school partnerships, because it, as it were, isn't any old partnership that delivers. There are some preconditions. So let's first of all start off by what's going on. And I'll look first of all at Multicanwe Trust. In July, I put in a Freedom of Information request to the department to say, how many Multicanwe Trusts have we now got? Because that actually wasn't out there anywhere. And on the left of the slide, we've got the pie chart that shows what the position was in 2011 in terms of the numbers of academies we had. And the big blue bit of the pie chart shows that most academies at that point were what were called standalone, freestanding. They weren't part of an academy trust with other academies. We can see that we did have some, roughly about a third, that were in quite small groupings of 2 to 5 academies. We then fast forward to July this year, and we can see that the number of standalone academies has grown because we've had all the converter stuff going on, but as a proportion, they've squeezed back down now to just being a third. And we can see there's been a big increase in the number of academies that are part of formal school groupings. 1470 in academies are in groups of 2 to 5, and we can see there's a lot that are in actually larger school groupings. So we can see there's been quite a sea change. Overall, we can see that there are nearly 5,000 now schools that are academies. That's about just under 2/3 of secondaries and about 16% of primaries. But when we look at the position in the Northwest and West Yorkshire, which is the region covered by, that's how the department, as it were, carves up the regional school commissioner boundaries. So it's the one I picked, the one that I thought was probably most relevant to this conference. It doesn't, here the position is not quite representative of what's going on nationally. We can see that actually just under half of schools are secondaries are academies, and only 9%. So both sectors, as it were, are not up to what's happening across the board. There's a relatively low number of sponsors as well, relative to other parts of the country, and that's interesting, particularly when you see that down the bottom it refers to the fact that Lancs and West Yorks has the highest number of secondary schools that are coasting or below the floor target. Now that's relevant because the education and adoption bill that is currently going through Parliament means that every school that is deemed inadequate by Ofsted will be automatically turned into an academy. No ifs, no buts, no decision by governors or anybody else, even theoretically no consultation, which we'll have to see how that works. So I think we can expect these numbers and these percentages to keep growing, particularly if there is a high proportion of weak schools. Multi-academy trusts aren't the only form of structured school partnership. We've had federations for quite a long time. The department doesn't publish any numbers. I don't think the department knows how many federations there are, but that we know there are quite a few. And of course, we also have teaching school alliances. We have nearly 700. This shows you geographically where they are. And we've got another round of teaching school alliances underway. So that's another form, a different form of formal school partnership. What's driving this move to formal school partnering? A whole series of factors. First of all, we've known for some considerable time, really going back to the 1990s, that when we had a weak or a struggling or a failing school, whatever word you want to use, that just parachuting in ahead, what was sometimes the media like to call superheads, didn't really work. It might have made a difference in the short term. Superhead moves on, school too often reverted. We learned that actually what worked was that for a school with a strong head, but a head with their school, with the systems that the school had, with the resources and the other leaders that the school had, bolting a weaker school and a stronger school together was a much more sustainable way, a model for creating school improvement, and that was what lay behind the concept of federations, sometimes called performance federations, led on to National Challenge Trust schools, has led on to multi-academy trusts. Though, we also have to say that not all multi-academy trusts have fulfilled, as it were, their remit. They've not been successful with all the weak and failing schools that they've been given, sometimes because they've taken on too many weak schools at the same time. There hasn't been enough school improvement expertise within the group. And so what we have increasingly seen is that some schools have been taken away from one sponsor and given to another sponsor. So it's not a surefire winner for turning around a failing school, but it is, when done properly, a good school improvement model, and that's one of the reasons. Another reason is very different. Schools, as we know, are learning institutions for children, but we know that on the whole, the best schools, teachers also see themselves as learners, but there aren't many adults in a school from whom to learn. It's, if you like, quite a small gene pool, as it were, whether that's a primary or a secondary, even though a secondary school might have perhaps 120 people, 120 staff, teachers and teaching assistants, might only, however, have 4, if it's lucky, or even 2 physics teachers. Won't have many modern foreign languages teachers. So the ability to learn from each other is going to be that much greater if schools work with other schools, so adults can learn and broaden their learning from working with adults. And we see that in how the thinking has developed over the past decade about professional development. Professional development, probably 10 to 15 years ago, was very much structured around sending our staff on a conference, on an inset, or on some particular program that was out of the classroom. Nothing wrong with that, and lots of learning that can be gained from it. But what we also know is that if we want teachers to change their behaviour in the classroom, they're unlikely to do it effectively just by going on a conference or a program. They're unlikely to change their behaviour effectively from reading in a book. To translate learning from, as it were, theory into practice, there needs to be coaching and feedback and learning. And therefore what we are doing, I mean, it's not universal, but I think I see it as I go around the school system, I see it beginning to become embedded, is linking, as it were, getting an expert external mastery input, whether that's to do with subject knowledge or whether that's to do with pedagogical approach, classroom behaviour, special needs, whatever the issue is, but then going on to linking the practice in the classroom to whether it's working in triads, whether it's working to then going back and redesigning the curriculum or doing some lesson planning together, whether it's then doing some action research in the light of what has been learned, or whether that's using some sort of video feedback, actually translating the learning into improved practice, and then obviously looking at what the impact is. So, for example, I was involved in the last year with a teaching school alliance in London that was had worked with 8 or 9 primary schools, brought 2 teachers in from each school at the beginning of term for 2 days with an expert maths practitioner, particularly working on problem solving, given the new SATs. However, very good, and they also did some observation of teaching within the school as well. So they saw it demonstrated as well as heard about it. Then went back to their own schools, and that was linked to 2 SLEs, Specialist Leaders of Education, going out and working in each of those schools, observing the practice of those who had been on the programme, and modelling and coaching them in their own classrooms and working with the curriculum leaders in their own schools, so the whole thing got embedded in their own schools. A prime example of what I'm talking about. Then need to see, of course, I don't quite know the end of the story in terms of what the impact was in terms of how then it helped the progress of pupils, but that would be easy enough to capture and to learn from. Also, we're seeing that as schools work, I mean, there are very few schools that are working in absolute isolation. All schools are working in some degree of partnership. What this slide shows is that really schools, as they develop their partnerships, are likely to become more formal. The two axes, we've got down the bottom, shallow to deep, running horizontally, running vertically, loose, informal partnership, tight, very structured partnership, like a federation or a MAT. What David Hargreaves observes, who did a lot of work for the National College, is that most partnerships start off, they don't really do terribly deep work with each other, and they're not terribly structured. It may be they share an inset, or it may be the Senkos get together, or maybe the head teachers meet together to share their SEFs. But as they get deeper and more extensive, and if it gets really deep, then they need to change their governance and think about how they're working together as a group of leaders to reflect the scale and scope and extent of how they're working together. So the partnerships that add most value are more likely to be formally organised and structured. We've got big challenges around recruiting teachers. We've got big challenges around recruiting heads. Sometimes we're only getting 2 or 3 applications. Sometimes we're having to re-advertise. Got a lot of positions very often in authorities where there's an acting head or a head that is covering 2 or 3 schools. Particularly acute very often for faith schools, and finding enough, as it were, who share the faith background, but are all suitable and equipped to be head teachers. And so what we're increasingly finding is that this model, where you have an executive leader working with a head of school, I mean, all the names, the titles may change a bit, but working, as it were, as a coach to mentor and support, is a very good model for growing leaders. There seems to be a big step up from being a deputy to being the head, which quite a lot of deputies are reluctant. They see what it's like, they see the pressure, the stress, the accountability, and they're not quite sure they want to do it. Actually, this model provides a route to grow them into that position. And I would say, or I would predict, that my view would be that probably most schools at the end of the next 5 years will be in that sort of model of leadership in some shape or form. That's the big change that we're, as it were, we're part way through at the moment. You will know, don't really have to say a lot about this, Schools Direct is not the only answer, certainly, to the problems with teacher recruitment, but it can be a very powerful thing, both in terms of developing staff within a school, particularly those who act as the mentors, to the Schools Direct trainees, but it can also be a way for a school to grow its own cadre of teachers. And to be involved in Schools Direct, you can't do it on your own. You've got to be part of a partnership or an alliance. Similarly, really, the funds that are now going out to schools to support other schools are being funneled through partnerships, either teaching school alliances, national support schools, or multi-academy trusts. And certainly the capacity building fund is only going to multi-academy trusts. At the end of November, George Osborne, as Chancellor, will deliver the spending review. He will tell all the public services how much money they're going to get for the next 3 or 4 years. But we know that in education, from what they've said, unless they change it, that funding for schools is going to get considerably tighter than it has been. It's not that I think budgets will be suddenly slashed, but you will find that your per pupil funding will not go as far as it has previously, and the uplifts that you get will have to pay for national insurance increases, for pension increases, for wage increases, and you will be struggling to make ends meet. It equates to over 4 years, and so not all at one time. It's as it were the ratchet tightens with each year, a 12% cut over 4 years. And we know, I mean, schools have choices to make. They're either going to, what they're going to do, cut down on non-contact time, going to cut teaching assistant posts, are they going to make teachers redundant? I would argue that they shouldn't start to think of any of that stuff. Actually, I think we need to increase non-contact time, because I think that's to do with the quality of the lessons. But that's another matter for another day. And we need to be looking at what we're doing jointly together and how I mean, it sounds corporate, it sounds commercial, but the language we need to think about is how we can take cost out by being smarter about what we do together as groups of schools. And I think that is more possible to do that in formal partnerships. It's also, I think, potentially, you'll tell me whether I'm wrong about this, but I think it can be quite lonely and isolated having to manage the whole change agenda on your own, because we were into a period when the curriculum is changing, the accountability in the form of tests or GCSEs or A-levels are changing, or even from baseline assessments for in the early years and below are changing. Everything is changing from that point of view. So around what you might call our core business, we've got the financial pressures, we've got recruitment issues to address, and at the same time we've got what I call mission creep. What I mean by mission creep is that in 2010, the coalition government said, we're dumping Every Child Matters, we're just going to focus on teaching and learning, and the Ofsted regime, as you may recall, got slimmed down. Extraneous stuff, as it was described, got stripped out. But over the 5 years of the coalition government, it's sort of grown back in because, oh, by the way, we're worried about terrorism and extremism and young people going off to Syria. So will you just please, schools, deal with that one? Well, not please, you are told you just have to deal with that one. We've had all the issues around, we know about child sex exploitation, Rotherham, and all the issues around safeguarding. Very big pressure on schools. Ofsted, I am told, in the new inspection regime, concentrating a lot on that. We have the well-being, a lot of concern about the mental health of young people, the obesity issues of particularly young children. And so we've got a whole set of issues that, as it were, schools are being asked to caretake or sort out for society. And I think it's a pretty tough ask, and I think it's much more possible if you can share out some of this load by working with others. Again, I don't think I need to say more about that. This one, we know we're on a journey. You'll probably come from different local authorities. You may still be working within a very well-resourced local authority. The chances nationally are that you're not. Some local authorities, as it were, have stripped out the whole of their education improvement function. Some of them have still got some resource. And what we are therefore seeing is fewer sort of local authority consultants come in, more relying on the resources of teaching school alliances and school-to-school support. Some places, SIPs, School Improvement Partners, are still there, but in other places they've gone, and there's a model of peer review. You may have read in the paper, for example, all the schools in Birmingham now are working to a model, a structured model. It's not a cosy model, it's a structured model of peer review. And we can see, therefore, that our language is around the role of academy trusts and teaching school alliances. We also have a challenge to provide enough places. And if an authority wants a new school, wants to use one of its existing schools to help provide those places, or to take over and support a weaker school, The rules now are, I don't make the rules, I just explain them, that really you've got to be an academy to do this stuff. So if you want to open or run a free school, which is what all new schools will be, or if you want to take on a school that is inadequate, you've got to be a sponsor. Them's the rules. And we've got more and more evidence that partnership does deliver. I'm not going to talk through all those things in the two right-hand columns. I've got a reference there so you can check it. But nor is it, as it were, we do this in partnership and presto, hey bingo, all the improvements suddenly materialise. We need to be clear that results take time to come through. Yesterday I was reading the paper that in Wales, where I do a lot of work, the Welsh nationalists were criticising a government programme called Schools Challenge Cymru, which is like Manchester Challenge and London Challenge, because after 1 year it hadn't delivered big increases in GCSE results. Now I think that was naive criticism. Results take time to come through, the deep results. You can get some early hits from working in partnership, but deep improvement takes time. Sometimes some schools will get more out of a partnership than others, though broadly speaking the benefits are two-way. And the bit that's dropped off the bottom of that slide is that partnerships need to work in an effective way. There are preconditions for getting these benefits. And that's the second bit of what I want to talk about, but I'm just going to pause there. That isn't to see if it. So let's go on. I'm going to talk about these 10 principles for effective schools, partnerships and trusts. This is the first point about the vision and the purpose. Really comes back to the schools that you're talking about. Make sure, I mean, there is a tendency that there could be in some parts of the country, when they saw the outcome of the election, the sort of, as it were, areas, particularly areas potentially like Bury, where there hadn't been any academies of either converter or even in some areas any sponsored academies. They suddenly thought, oh well, government's now here for another 5 years, we've got to come to terms with this reality. And almost there was a panic set in. Now, they may need to change, but we don't do partnership for the sake of it. We need to be clear about what it is we want to do together, what the purpose of the partnership is, what the moral, you know, whether our values fit with each other, whether we're clear about what we want to do together. And we then need to turn that into a plan, and we need to turn that into priorities and success measures. But at the heart of it is there a really shared sense of endeavour, a mission about the journey we want to go on as a group of schools? That is really, really important. It sounds, I don't know whether it sounds soft, but it's really important. There is then an issue, and I think this is the single most important thing, the thing I hope I might leave with you today, this issue to do with scale. If you think about your human relationships, our individual relationships, we only have a few people with whom we share our deepest, darkest lives and sort of secrets and so forth. We might then have other people who are good and strong friends, and we'll have a wider group who are acquaintances, and then we'll have those people who, when we see walking down the road, or we see them in the supermarket, we sort of never really known her name, but I nod to them and smile at them and so forth. At least you do if you live in suburban Epsom, which is where I live. But, so we have these sort of, as it were, ways that we relate to different numbers of people. It's the same when we think about organisations. So this is a slide from George Berwick, who's involved in Challenge Partners. Some of the schools in Challenge Partners has about 300 schools. Some of them are academies, some are not. Quite a lot of them are members of teaching school alliances, and they work together in triads, in threes. And he first of all observes this point again about the partnership journey, that schools may be in isolation, but then they go through an initiation. You're just about to go down that path potentially. And then there's real serious engagement, and then you come to integration, which is some way down the road. What should drive that is, he suggests, what really brings schools together is, as it were, again, what's going on in the classroom around research, testing things, working out through research what is best practice, And that comes from teachers and leaders working together. And the more they do it, the closer that they will come. That should be at the heart of what is driving the partnership. There may be a lot of other extraneous stuff that's going on, but that's really the thing that will take them on their journey. And his argument is that you can only do that in a relatively small group. You can't have that close, deep form of working with 20 or 30. You can really only have it with about 3 or 5. But they also make sense sometimes. If you only do things in 3s and 5s, that's an inhibitor because there's a diseconomies of scale. So it may make sense to do some things at a broader, bigger level, whether your broader, bigger level is a federation, is a teaching school alliance, is a local authority partnership, or a MAT. What that says if you're a teaching school alliance, if a teaching school alliance isn't using cluster and hub working, I would want to challenge it, right? But equally, if a school was just working in a nice cosy little unit of 3 or 5, I want to say you're at risk of your learning being narrow. So it's not either or, and we need to calibrate that, and we need to, this sort of sets out a model that, let's suppose all these schools are part of Multicanwe Trust, that really what Multicanwe Trust have had to learn is that as they get bigger, they need to be amoeba-like and move into these sort of clusters with a lead or executive leader, and then work out what they do. They might do things like middle leadership development, or they might do certain curriculum programs across the whole trust, but they'll do other things just within their cluster. So it's working out what you do at what level. And so a school is likely to be part of more than one partnership. It may be a member of a formal school group, say a trust, but it might still be part of a sixth form consortium. Certainly it might still be working with another school on a school improvement issue, even if it is part of a MAT. It might do that. There's no reason why it shouldn't be part of your JPD work. Or it could be a strategic partner of a teaching school alliance, and it might be getting its business support from elsewhere. But again, if we're going to go for that sort of model, and I guess some schools will recognise that as describing how they currently function, again, we need to be clear about the purpose of each of the partnerships. We don't do partnerships for the sake of it because they take up time and resources, so we need to have clarity about what the role and purpose of each of those is. If you then translate that to a borough level, you then need to think about what do you do at a borough level. What you get in some places, like for example, I know in Wigan, they have phase partnerships, and I think they have 3 secondary and 5 primary, so partly geographical, partly phase, and then they have local groups of schools within each. So they have an improvement board here, they have consortia here, and they have individual schools and academy trusts and federations here. That's one way of doing it. But we need to be clear about how we organise that, and before deciding on structures, we need to be clear about what the role. Here, what they have in some local authorities, that they've got school leaders who work with the local authority to take an overview of how all schools, whether they're an academy trust or not, how all schools are performing in real time. And they have agreed with school leaders, if you like, data and other ways that they track. And that board, sometimes it's called a commissioning board because it then commissions support through an alliance, through a MAT, through a JPD initiative, or through whatever. But there needs to be clarity about what the purpose is, and then we can agree the structure. Governance of partnerships is important. Got 2 slides on this. This more describes how governance might look in a more informal partnership or a teaching school alliance, where I would expect to see governors involved, either a lead governor or a governor's committee. You've got strategic direction and coordination, which might be done through a heads group, or sometimes there is an executive leader, or there's one of the heads acts as a lead. And then you've got delivery and implementation, which is often done by deputies, assistants, and others. And captured formal memorandum of understanding, sometimes a company to capture it. important mechanisms of consultation and dialogue. In a MAT, it will look slightly different. The layered governance is more formal. MAT members, their role is often neglected, but I think they can and do have an important role. And again, a good MAT will have got really good formal schemes of delegation and be clear what the board is doing, what a local governing body or an academy council is doing, and working that through. So when you come to that, you don't have to invent the wheel yourself. You should be able to access and find out what lots of other, you may change it, but so you're not all going to invent your own safeguarding policies. You may tweak it for your context, but you can have a common core. Or in your spending allocations, you can decide what the sign-offs are at board level, levels of expenditure, and what will be signed off at a school level, for example. In terms of school performance, what's going to be organised and overseen at a school level, and how the board is going to take a strategic overview of how schools are doing. So there needs to be, again, clarity. We understand about distributed leadership within schools. Distributed leadership within partnerships is vital. This is a slide from a woman called Joanna Quinn. I was sitting at the National College listening to her, and I said, can I use your slide? I nick slides from all sorts of people. And she had this really, it's what we're working to in this country. Essentially, absolutely fundamental, we have people within schools, heads of schools, who define and see and understand their role, not in terms of having to manage lots of everyday dross, but see themselves as leaders of learning and orchestrating the improvements in learning, that they are themselves a learner, and that's their role, that's their prime role, they're a head teacher. We then need people who are leading improvement across more than one school, in the model I've described, executive leaders, and we have people increasingly, whether in alliances or CEOs of MATs, or even in, arguably, some might say even regional schools commissioners, are sort of, as it were, system leaders who are leading learning across a wider, either geographical or a school network, or a wider partnership or alliance. But within a partnership and within a trust, this is dragon boat racing. And we need somebody who's doing the steering, setting direction. We need somebody at the back who's beating the drum, and I liken the drum to, as it were, project management, making sure that the basics get done, that when decisions are taken, that they're followed up, that it isn't, that there's action. It isn't just hot air. So there's a sort of consistency and there's progress being made. And then we have the rowers, the people who are actually making change and improvement happen. And I argue that very often what makes a difference in a partnership being good to really soaring ahead is when the partnership manages to enable middle leaders to take on the tasks that relate to what it is the partnership is trying to do. So it's too often, I sometimes find that, as it were, the partnership is operating well at the level of senior leaders. They all know what they're trying to achieve, but it's not really flowing at the level at which really the real activity happens, where the action is. Heads of year, heads of subjects, people who are teachers themselves. You can make it part of the performance management to, as it were, lead strands of work that relate to the partnership's agenda over a year. So on these sorts of issues, whether the partnership's agenda, these may not be what's on your partnership's agenda, but whatever's on your partnership agenda, empowering middle leaders to play a part is, it seems to me, vital. We then need to use expertise through our SLEs, joint curriculum leads, all those sorts of other ways that we can do it. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move quickly. A robust business model. you may again have got this sorted, but again, in a multi-academy trust, it's not straightforward, because there can be discussions and arguments about what the top slice is, how much they pay from the school into a central trust. But those discussions also have to take place within a softer partnership. Are you going to have a membership fee of so much per pupil, so much per school? Are you going to use a pay-as-you-go basis? Are you going to just give each other support in kind? You need to resource a partnership properly. It won't go anywhere if you try and do it, as it were, on the cheap. And then what you need to do is to use the partnership. I often say appoint a business manager, invest in their salary, and then get them to earn back their salary from the savings they make for you 2 or 3 times over. That's the sort of, by addressing that sort of agenda. Again, the contrast between alliances and multi-academy trusts is quite acute on this. In academy trusts, the buck stops with the board, with an executive leader, with a CEO. And therefore they tend to have quite rigorous, as it were, ways of knowing what is happening in each academy. At least they should do. There's no excuse if they haven't got it. In an alliance, it can be tough. I mean, a good alliance or a good partnership, interesting to know whether your JPD partnership does this, by being in each other's classrooms, by sharing data, by sharing CEFs, by sharing school improvement plans. You should know each other's schools by doing learning walks, by doing joint lesson observations. That is how you get to know each other's schools. Can you have the sort of partnership where you can, as it were, what I call it, so that if you see a school, you know the school because you're in the school, you know it's struggling or it's going south, right? And you know it's vulnerable if Ofsted were to call. Does your partnership legitimise you saying to the head and to the governors, I'm sorry, but you've got to accept support? Now maybe that's really, really tough stuff for a partnership to be able to do. So it can be hard. More possible to do it within a formal structured school partnership in a federation or a trust. Yep, if the partnership's not, this is it, you're right. If it's not about teaching and learning and thinking about the pedagogy and thinking about the kids and how we improve the rate of progress, I don't know what the partnership's for. Could say a lot more on that, but that's got to be the core business. And it's about growing together around that. It's not, as it were, imposing, but it's about, it's not one school imposing its way of working unless one school is really, really broke. It's about understanding how each other work and doing those things jointly. Leadership pipeline, assigning leaders across schools for half a term, for particular tasks, using executive leaders and allowing backfilling, linking training and practice. I mean, we know it's really, really powerful means for leaders to practice leadership. All this I've said, I mean, both Academy Trust and Teaching and School Alliance have their respective strengths and weaknesses. The best partnerships get this balance between structure, hierarchy, where the buck stops, but if they just do that and operate in a very rigid and formal way, then you will miss the dynamism of some of the flowy things of joint practice development, of leadership development, of what I call high social capital, of things like in some trusts they have things like network nights or speed dating where staff can share ideas in a very dynamic and fluid way. So we've got to get a balance between hierarchy and networking. And finally, we need to know that partnership is making a difference. This is taken from another, I don't know whether you have one in the Northwest, but in the Southwest, the Regional Schools Commission has introduced a means of describing where MATs are for them to assess themselves. And at the heart of it, there's a lot of things that relate to the sort of things I've been talking about, but he then has this: how much progress is the partnership, is the trust adding for the kids? And that's a really good test. There's another way you could do it. If your partnership is going to be really achieve things, it will need some sort of plan. Maybe it looks a bit elaborate, but I was working with an Academy Trust yesterday that's working on precisely this, mapping out what it's going to do together, what its priorities are for the next 5 years in these different areas: people, teaching and learning, finance, business, and its organisational, and then setting milestones. That will be another way of tracking progress and impact. Or if you're a Teaching School Alliance, or if you're not, this is one of my favourite ways. This is John Hattie, Visible Learning. If you're not familiar with his work, he uses this. It's a bit like the Education Endowment Foundation, the People Premium Toolkit stuff, where you can work out whether there's a very simple tool, an Excel spreadsheet you can use, where if you assess kids at the start and assess kids at various jumping off points and at the end, you can really understand the impact of particular interventions and whether your intervention is going into really what he calls the zone of desired effects. We could have a whole session on this, and arguably this is the sort of thing that we shouldn't be talking about structures all the time. This is actually what we should be talking about, because this is really what is going to make the difference to kids' life chances and to our education system when we actually work together about how we improve teaching and learning. But, so in that sense, the partnership thing we need to be very clear about is a means to the end, and the end is all about that. I think I'm a bit over, aren't I? But I hope that that's been useful, and I hope the rest of your afternoon is valuable as well. Thank you.